you again for joining today. This is a topic where we'll cover some general aspects of grief and loss, some general aspects of supporting others, and also coping yourself with grief and loss. But we're going to go a little bit deeper into introducing this topic of cultural bereavement, which, as you'll see, is really an emerging label or concept that really the grief and loss field is still grappling with and trying to understand. So I'm excited that you're here with me and showing some interest in this. I think that, a lot of us can connect to it in a lot of different ways. And I think it can help us to understand other people that we're living with in our neighborhoods, our families, our friends, and just be better neighbors. So we will get started. As I mentioned, I'll just start by reviewing a bit about what grief is and what it's not so that we're all on the same page. And then I'll get into more of the specifics around this cultural bereavement conversation. Um, what does it mean? How has it evolved over time? What is the impact? Why is it important? And also, what is this path ahead looking like? And then one of the most asked questions that our team gets is how to support someone who's grieving. And so I'm going to put the cultural bereavement lens over that a little bit and have a conversation about that as well. So please send over any questions that come up along the way. That's really how I can tailor this to what your interest is in this topic. So just talking about grief is it's difficult, as Elisa said. But it really is very human. It's part of what life is for us, and it begins when we first start to form bonds and attachments to the people, places, and things that matter to us. This is an image of a parent holding a child and a child holding a doll, and their arms are forming those literal connections, but it also conveys that emotional connection that exists as well. And you can imagine that if one of those connections were lost or threatened, there would be some sort of response to that, right? We would expect that. That would be normal. That would be natural. Well, that's really what grief is, what that grief example is. Um, we often think of it as being connected to a death, and that certainly can be the case. Most often, I think people think of losing a loved one, perhaps their pet, a coworker, even. I think sometimes that can be a little bit of a disenfranchised experience where you're not quite sure how to go about the grief that comes up from that experience. But even an acquaintance and a public persona, we form these attachments to people that are part of our lives. And we're seeing that really casts a wide net in it as far as the way that grief hits us when we learn of someone's death. But through our lives, there really is so much more grief and so much more loss than something that is related to a death. So it's also important to highlight all of these other non-death experiences of loss because they really are peppered throughout our lives. I mean, really, you start to look at this and wonder, is anyone ever not grieving in some way, right? Because there's so much loss as part of our life. And part of what the goal is today is to get to the point where we talk about, well, how do we cope with that? So some non-death losses could include a change in relationship. It could be just that natural transition of life from one chapter to another. And many of these may be seen as a positive and even celebratory experience, but there's inherently loss connected because there's change. This could also be a loss of, your own self-identity, an aspect of yourself that changes over time because of a specific event or just through growth. It could also be the loss of a treasured object, which can sometimes be overlooked or minimized. But I think that when we consider what those more concrete objects could be, I mean, that could be home, which is a physical thing, but it's also not. Um, maybe losing the connection to that neighborhood or the common connections that you had in that neighborhood, either to people or to places. and certainly anything that we've inherited or has a lot of special meaning to, it doesn't feel quite right without it. So when we experience these losses, as I said, it's very natural and normal to have some sort of response to that. Everyone is going to have their own response, even to the same experience of grief. So we can use a family as an example where maybe someone does die in that family. Everyone is going to experience it differently from their own perspective, with their own personality, with their own character traits and skills and strengths, and also the quality of that relationship and what this loss means to them. That's all going to be filtered through their own unique grief experience. And so when we look at a family of, we'll say, four people, just four family members, they're all going to have those unique experiences of emotional response, of physical response, and cognitive and social and spiritual. So, really, it's a holistic perspective of what's going on for someone in the wake of that loss. Now, again, it could be a death, it could be something connected to a life transition. These are all things that could be rippling through someone's life and creating these grief responses. So I just want to highlight that that really is very unique. And even for one person experiencing a loss now versus 2 years from now, they may experience very different responses. So when we're talking about these things, I think emotional responses are usually the primary thought, and it can be a whole spectrum of emotional responses. It could be shock and numbness, it could be anger, it could be guilt, regret. There could be just sadness and longing, and the pain that accompanies the loneliness. So that emotional response can really change very drastically, even from 1 hour to the next, and certainly over time. Physically, we know that the body is also impacted by grief. And this can take place with just the disruption of patterns, whether it's your appetite changing or your sleep patterns changing. We do know that there's a cardiovascular connection to grief. So if that's a risk for someone, we want to keep special attention on that. But even just feeling sluggish or fatigued, not feeling motivated, or maybe just go, 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 and not giving yourself time to rest. Those can be some physical changes as well. With anything physical and with anything cognitive, which we're getting into, we're going to want to have some medical attention surrounding those symptoms just to make sure that there's not something larger at play. And certainly with anything pre-existing, we would want to know, what's counterindicated. Cognitively, the changes in grief are very dramatic. Um, I, I think that's one of the most common comments that I'll get from people is that they just don't feel like themselves. They never imagined that they would be struggling in this way, but they're really struggling to coordinate, to plan, to recall details, in the short term, which can be really concerning for people, especially with the more we learn about dementia and the risk factors and the early warning signs. But it is very common for the brain to respond in that way, where it's really prioritizing those day to day function tasks like breathing and eating and digesting. It's not so much focused on more of the complicated, higher thinking tasks like planning and coordination. So it's really difficult, especially because planning and coordination is a lot of what we do in the days after a death, or associated to a big move or to a job change. And those things we can't do very well. So it really it burns people out, and it can make them feel like they're not doing a good job, that they're not going about this right, that there's something wrong. When in actuality, it's just very natural. That's the brain's response to this event. Socially, can there can be some pretty big impact as well for people who are struggling. It's hard for their support systems to see them hurting, for them to seem different than themselves. And so that support that maybe was there before in the good times might struggle to know how to show up now in the hard times. We also know that people who are grieving just can struggle sometimes with being out and about, and they may need some time to themselves, but that's different than self-isolating. And so making sure that there's some meaningful support, meaning that, just because this person has a lot of friends doesn't mean that those friends are able to support them in the way they need right now. So what does meaningful social support look like in that moment? And do they have access to it? Spiritually, we also know that grief can really impact folks, and this can be related to religion and faith as far as whether they feel affirmed in those beliefs or whether they're questioning it. But it also can just be the experience of your world being flipped upside down and not really knowing who you are anymore. Um, Maybe reprioritizing, how you spend your time and who you spend it with. These are other spiritual responses as well. So I'm going to go through some different kinds of losses and of grief, and I'm going to connect them here to some cultural bereavement examples as well, just as we start to get into that topic in a little bit more depth. So secondary losses. If we think of a primary loss as that water drop that's hitting the surface of the water, that's the primary loss. And anything that ripples out from that, any of the ways that life changes because of that event, that would be considered a secondary loss. So, we could use conflict as an example, a war or some sort of threat to safety that's happening in someone's home. That event then causes them to have to leave, and all of what is lost and all of the way that life continues to change from that point forward would be considered a secondary loss. Ambiguous losses mean that either someone is physically present, but they've psychologically changed, or vice versa, that they feel that emotional relationship still feels very real, but physically, this person is no longer there. So it's a lot of examples of that with cultural bereavement and the idea of being separated from someone that you have a deep relationship with, or having moved with someone perhaps and feeling like, yes, they're physically here, but psychologically they're not the same person that I knew before. And that identity has changed and this relationship has changed. Disenfranchised grief is a sense that I am experiencing grief and I'm struggling, but the people around me minimize that experience. They make me feel like it's not valid or that I'm not worthy of feeling this way. Maybe I'm over exaggerating or I'm too sensitive. This can be that experience of feeling disenfranchised. And it's really common in circumstances where your lived experience just doesn't reflect the larger group that you're either living within, working within. People are kind of acting like nothing has happened, and you feel like your world is falling apart. Traumatic grief is an experience where some element of trauma is also embedded within the grief. So there's a saying that there is, let me get it right, that there is not always trauma in grief, but there is always grief in trauma. There's always a loss connected to a traumatic event or a traumatic experience. And so unfortunately, a lot of these conversations of cultural bereavement include an element of trauma in one way or another. Mainstream grief is an important concept just to highlight as we get into these definitions of cultural bereavement, because it, the mainstream grief that we see as a society, is just like these boxes on a conveyor belt. It's one and the same. Everyone is expected to act the same along the same timeline. their needs are the same, and they're, capable of the same things. It's simply not the truth. And that's even outside of a conversation about cultural bereavement, because we all have culture and it differs from, what the social expectation is in a broader sense. And so mainstream grief is something that's really difficult, um, period, but especially when what is mainstream to you is not reflected at all in the world that you're living in. So let's jump into this cultural bereavement. And I'll just say I'm not an expert on cultural bereavement. This is something that I've kind of had my finger on the pulse of and have found very interesting, um, and wanted just to introduce it. I think that it's important, and it highlights a lot of interesting facets of grief in general for any of us. But certainly some of the more recent conflicts in the world, and refugees and migrants that are really traveling all across the globe in seeking safety and opportunity. I think that it's really significant to introduce this, especially within the grief and loss space. So the actual definition that we can look at is losing those familiar social structures, the cultural values, and self-identity. So we're not just talking about, I can't eat my food anymore. I can't go to the same grocery store. Um, I can't go to the same, neighborhood spots. We're not just talking about one of those. We're talking about really all of them that equate to also losing connection to the values and to the cultural expectations, to the identities, and to all of the ways that, uh, I used to be able to go about my life, and now that's changed because of expectations and a social structure. I think that the more helpful definition, it comes from, an immigrant herself, who said, "It's like I've been an old, mature tree who's been replanted into new soil." And I think that that really offers a powerful image where we can understand almost inherently how difficult that is, right? But let's get into more of the specifics to really understand on a deeper level, why is this so difficult? So I have this friend, from the UNHCR, just showing the amount of displaced people in our world. And that line, that vertical line, is marking 2014. So that's about 10 years ago. And you can see that that number was at 60 million, and we've doubled to almost 120 million in the last 10 years, which really demonstrates a much higher increase compared to decades prior, at least going to 93. So I think that that just helps to illustrate, as we talk about, where did this concept of cultural bereavement come from? What was informing it? A lot of it was what was happening in our world, and these experiences that people were having, reporting them to providers, and providers wondering, what are we dealing with here? Right? So this is one of those instances where there's something that's prevalent, and we're just trying to find a way to identify it, and to justify it or normalize it, validate it. I think finding a term can really legitimize it. So back in 91, which, just to reference, that's really at a time that's at the start of this chart that we're talking about. That's about the history that we can talk about when it comes to cultural bereavement. It first came up in 91 in a research study that was looking at the experiences of, Cambodian refugees. And they were recognizing that it kind of felt like culture shock, but it really was so much more complex. And the study really sought out to capture all of the emotions and the mental health symptoms that people in this study were experiencing. And they suggested at the end of their study that really this was worthy of some ongoing research to explore more of the anxiety, the depression. There was even some prevalence of PTSD that they thought maybe that fit. So we're looking at what we would call like a differential diagnosis. What are some diagnoses that we're considering here? What are some terms that might fit these experiences? Because truthfully, the experience doesn't really fit anything of what we have, right? Fast forward 14 years to 2005, and there's another study that really expanded this concept of cultural bereavement. Instead of just refugees, now we're looking at immigrants in general, as well as their children, and the impact that can be felt even for that next generation, whether they were involved in the actual, in the actual relocation, or if they're just kind of experiencing that ripple effect, those secondary losses, and the ways that their family and their identity has changed now since they've moved to this new location. So this former identity feels completely lost. Whatever that was is now just replaced with a term migrant. I think one of the examples that I read was someone who had been, a marketing executive in his home country, and once he moved to a new country, it was now a migrant marketing executive, and he wasn't able to find work at that level. So I forget now what yeah, I don't remember what job he ended up getting in the new country, but just illustrating that it's almost like you lose all of that history, you lose all of that identity, and instead, this is now how people refer to you. This is how people view you, see you, and it changes the expectations of them. So the paper really talks about how this requires a whole reorganization of the self. And it includes so many layers of stress that it really is very complex. So it's really supporting the study from 91 and just expanding that, but still not offering many answers. So in 2023, another study was released, this time looking at Ethiopian refugees who had relocated to South Korea for various different reasons. Um, and this is where we see the term of cultural bereavement really be characterized by a complex mental distress. So we're hitting on, the varied mental symptoms. We're also hitting on just how complex this is, how many layers there are of stress and strain and change. And they use this study to educate some nonprofit organizations on this title, so that they can begin to legitimize the experiences of these Ethiopian refugees in South Korea, and giving it a name and explaining that this is something that it's a normal response to an abnormal experience, and there's nothing wrong with you. This is a challenge, yes, and there's going to be aspects that you struggle with, but there's nothing wrong with you. So this really invited those conversations about the phenomenon in a more boots on the ground way. And it's really grown since then. So a lot of the sources that I even found were from 2023, 2024. So this really is emerging, and that's why we have some questions to talk about too at the end of all of this. But yes, it highlighted secondarily that many others are navigating cultural bereavement in some capacity. This really isn't a prevalent conversation within our own Western culture, and certainly within health providers and the mental health sphere. We do see this come up in some nebulous ways around conversations with just being, a child of an immigrant, and feeling the sense that I should know more about my family or my history. And I think in the US, some of that cultural bereavement can even be connected to our history of slavery and our history of Indigenous people and the clash there. So I think that some of this is really, it has much deeper roots than what we've even explored yet. I'm bringing this up to highlight the impact on bereavement. And I think that one of the reasons it's important is because sometimes this presentation of grief can really be very complicated. It can look like one thing, but not quite fit. And so we're as a provider, we're stuck with wondering, okay, well, how do I help? And the person who's experiencing it is wondering, what is this? What do I do? And so a lot of the times people may not even share. They may not share at all. And even if they do, there may be a struggle to identify the cause. Um, the other piece is that so much of this experience of being in a new place and having experienced a lot of loss and even trauma potentially, is that there's really a desire to assimilate and just fit in and be able to integrate into this new culture and this new way of life in order to succeed, in order to, um, you know, maybe seek out opportunities that didn't exist before, um, or secure that future for your children for generations to come. And so I think that assimilation can be really complicated. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's such a difference in social structures and cultural values, in the ways that people see themselves and also how they're seen by others, and that perception. I think so. With that assimilation, the grief then can feel more intense because there's a discomfort in feeling different, right? And so that grief can just makes me feel even more different, which then pushes me to want to assimilate more so that I fit in. But but then the grief is even more intense because I'm not honoring it. I'm not allowing it to move through me. And really, and we hear this from later generations after, immigrants come to America, for instance, and we hear from their later generations that it really is a loss of connection, a loss of identity, a loss of understanding of what the significance there was to begin with. So this can really have a big impact on bereavement and just the way that people get support. There's also a real barrier to utilizing or engaging in significant rituals. So perhaps, perhaps there is, a loss before someone moves, before they're dislocated, um, and now they've lost connection to either a burial plot or a temple, um, that really significant place where they formed connection, where they revisited and had those rituals, even paid homage to ancestors or visited graves. So even just to have that long distance separation can be really difficult and can be a barrier in people being able to access those feelings of grief. I think the other thing is that if there's loss experienced or specifically a death experienced after someone has moved into a new place, they may not have the same sort of availability to carry out their rituals. There's a lot of different examples of cultural rituals that just exist within their own culture and not within another culture. So being able to, whether it's just accompany a body to the funeral home, that's not always an option in the US, but it might be the option for them back home, and that might be the expectation even. And so those differing perspectives can cause some barriers here to feel like I didn't do what I needed to. Like my own belief is that I needed to do that, but I wasn't allowed to. And so there can also be some misunderstanding of those rituals, not understanding this, people in this second place, in this new place, who don't understand the rituals, don't understand the significance, and then those things don't happen. And now that person who's grieving is trying to figure out how to deal with that themselves, how to rectify that. And this can really come down to some legal ramifications as well. I think the best example, just to kind of give you a concrete example with all of these abstracts, because there's so many. The idea of being able to recreate a funeral, for parents who are from India, the desire to scatter ashes into the water because that is their belief and that's their ritual and that's what's meaningful to them, and that's sacred. And there are places in the US where you can't do that. There's a lot of rules around what can be disposed of in our water. And so how can that be reworked or can it be? What are the things that we need to explore there? Certainly, most of the time that conversation isn't happening. And so instead, families are grappling with, well, how this is what we need to do to honor our person, and we're not able to, and so that you can understand the guilt and the sadness that really comes along with that. So there can be some real ways, especially when it comes to death and rituals, where this impacts bereavement and someone's grief moving forward. I like to just highlight rituals for a slide further because rituals really are so integral to our experience of grief as humans. They come pretty naturally, actually, and it's something we've been doing for thousands of years. It's something that we did well before there were texts about psychology and grief experts. It's something that we do that's really personal, that honors a connection we have to someone, something, somewhere. And to not have access to that can really have a huge impact on folks, to feel like something is incomplete, that something doesn't feel real because we never gathered for a funeral, because we never lit a candle, because we didn't release that lantern. Whatever the ritual and belief is, it's really important to find a way to feel that that has been accomplished. The impact on bereavement as far as missing out on community. So this could be a perception that however someone is responding to their grief is, it's inappropriate or it's abnormal. And so some of those terminology can be really harmful, and really in the medical community have a really big impact on how someone is treated and how someone is cared for, and what they access and what they don't. But even within their own families, within their own communities, understanding what is expected of you as far as behavior. Some cultures believe in being very emotive, and that the more you cry actually honors the experience of loss more. And others believe in being very stoic. And so you can imagine if someone stoic is displaced into a country where there's a lot of emotional expression, that's that's one element of culture shock. But you add the layers of everything else, and that really is cultural bereavement, trying to navigate, well, I'm grieving, but I don't show it in that way. And now I'm worried that I won't get what I need because my grief doesn't look the way they're expecting grief to look like. So there can be a lot of suppression, just on an individual level, um, or even more broadly, um, or just straight up misunderstanding. So naming cultural bereavement can be really, really meaningful. Again, it just conveys the distress in all of the layers that it exists within, and is really more specific to the experience that they're having. As far as the path ahead, what's known and what's unknown, there is a bit of a new frontier. So as you saw, we're having rising rates of displacement for a number of reasons. Yes, we're very familiar with a lot of the conflict that's happening around the world. There's also a lot of environmental changes that are making certain areas of our world no longer habitable. And globalization, people are seeking opportunity in different places, and that could either be because they're moving towards a carrot, an incentive, something that seems like a positive thing for them, their families, or because they're trying to seek a safer space, whether that's environment, whether that's conflict, whether it's persecution, there maybe just a different political reality. So there's a lot of reasons why these rates of displacement are increasing. I think displacement can make it seem like it's never a choice. I think there are certainly times when it is a choice for someone to leave, but a lot of what these rising rates reflect is that it's a force that's occurring. And so that also can impact someone's cultural bereavement, and whether they feel that they had control or they didn't, whether they feel like they had choice, how rapid and sudden did everything take place? Were they prepared? There's a lot of aspects around this that can really paint a very different picture of cultural bereavement. So some interesting research questions that you know where we're kind of left wondering. Certainly, we are more connected virtually through social media and other tools than we were from 1991. And so, what role does that play in cultural bereavement? Does it feel like it helps? Um, to what extent is it still a challenge? What is the interplay of some different vulnerability factors like race, social isolation, poverty that can really impact access to supports? And then some preventative measures, just, when these circumstances are anticipated, what are some interventions that can take place in order to maybe lessen the burden of mental distress, to help maybe integrate people into a new space, a new location, to help with employment. What are some of those things that we can consider as far as making sure that, that culture shock, that distress, isn't as distressing? Can't take it away completely. It's still going to be a change, and that's part of life, and that's part of the difficulty of grief. Um, but what can we do that might just alleviate some of that? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to support, and this is specific to supporting folks who are facing that cultural bereavement experience. But there's a lot within this that is also very foundational, something that we could use for anyone. So just starting off with using that term cultural bereavement, helping to legitimize that, yes, this is actually a term because it is such a difficult experience for people, and there's so many layers that, yes, this is something, um, so also exploring a cultural history, whether it's you or someone that you love who you're seeking to support, helping them consider, what what do I know, and where do I still have questions when it comes to my connection to my culture, my connection to my family's history, um, rediscovering for themselves that cultural identity. Maybe it's someone whose parents moved here a long time ago, or maybe they themselves moved here a long time ago, and they're trying to unearth some of what has been covered up in hopes of assimilating. And so discovering those cultural identity pieces. I also think it might be possible that some of you may be supporting someone who is leaving the US, and trying to help, or even honestly, even just another state sometimes feels like a totally different culture. And so how can you support someone who's going through that change? Um, and trying to maintain that cultural identity in some ways, right? It's okay to evolve and change, but um, what makes them them? And that's this other part, is identifying the connection to self. So what about all of these labels feels true to me? What about all of these things that my family has gone through, or that I know about my culture? How does that connect to me and the way that I see the world and the way that I walk through the world and see myself? I think the other thing that can be really supportive, is encouraging connection. So finding other people within that community in order to connect, and whether it's to speak the same language, um, or to talk about the favorite foods that they loved, or the places that they visited, um, the specific streets that they lived on. Um, I myself am not from Buffalo, New York, and one of the things that I have come to really be entertained by and enjoy, is when people in Buffalo identify that they grew up in the same neighborhood, and they start talking about the streets that they lived on, and so lived on that corner, and do you remember, the dog from this house? And those that's an experience of connection that can really fill your cup. And especially if you've lived for years without it, if you miss home dearly, and you're able to find someone by some chance who can connect with you on that, it can really make a huge difference. I came across a story of a man in the US who would call a bar in Ireland, I think it was, so that because they knew that bar, they spoke the same language as them. And so they would just have a quick chat, but finally be able to share their language, which I forget what it was now. Um, and they formed a connection in that way, so finding those ways, hopefully you don't have to go that far. But even just finding connection to books that were maybe written by an author with the same identity, cooking old recipes or rediscovering ingredients, watching movies that depict those places. It may not be perfect, but it can help to feel connected. Um, if you haven't spoken a language and there's a different language within your cultural history, maybe that feels connecting. Um, and still celebrating holidays and maybe bringing people into that too, so that you can create a community that even if they don't share cultural identity with you or history with you, you can share that about yourself. Okay. This is one of my favorite slides to share for any presentation, because so much of the questions that we get are what do I say and what do I not say when someone's grieving. Um, and so this is a handout that you're free to call us, email us to get more because there's a lot more examples. But it is from the Dougie Center, so you can also find it online if you'd prefer. But it gives an example of a statement that we often say to other people that even when we say it, we probably feel like it's not quite right. But words fail when it comes to grief, and sometimes we're in positions where we need words. So this offers some ideas, but the idea of saying, I know what you're going through. Well, especially when it comes to cultural bereavement, there's probably a lot that I don't understand if I don't share the same sort of family history, cultural history, even just experience of being displaced. And so talking about instead, it's always so unique. This experience is so unique for everyone. What's it been like for you? What are you struggling with right now? Kind of reframing that. This worksheet is great at giving some, or handout rather, is great at giving some ideas on just how to reframe the intention of the statement, instead of it being received in a way that may not feel so great to the other person. So, did you get closure? Well, what does that mean, right? Like, it's really difficult. And also, if I say no, are you prepared to have that conversation with me? Because it's really hard. So instead, how does your family mark major life transitions like this? Or how has your family, been dealing with this? Um, are there rituals that are really important within your culture? Just seeking understanding. Easier said than done. The other thing I just want to point out is that a lot of the time when it comes to supporting someone in their grief, whether it's cultural bereavement or otherwise, um, we don't always have to say something. We can use acknowledgement as a way to just make them aware that we are open and willing to listen to them. Um, and so just making yourself available, not trying to put any expectations on them or make any assumptions about their experiences, but instead to just allow them to talk, to see them for who they are, to hear about their experiences, just to be witnessed in that way, I think is really powerful. So this whole concept comes from Megan Devine. She's a psychotherapist, and you can find a short animation where she really talks about this in more depth, and she uses the rabbit and the bear as characters to help illustrate this concept of acknowledgement. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. I know we have a little bit of time left, so I'm just going to open it up for your questions and comments. I'm curious to hear what you're all thinking about, but I'm just going to leave this slide up for a little bit so that you have access to our phone number and to our email in case you'd like to reach out.
Thank you for such a great presentation, Anna. It looks like we got to thank you for the very interesting perspectives you shared, very informative. Um, if anyone has, I'm going to actually right now stop the recording.